James Carter had always believed in justice. He joined the police force to make a difference, to protect the innocent, and to serve his community. But over the years, he saw things that made his stomach turn. He saw officers abusing their power, covering up crimes, and treating people unfairly. And at the center of it all was Captain Mark Stevens. Captain Stevens was a powerful man in the department. He had been on the force for over 20 years, and people either feared him or followed him without question. He had a way of making things disappear: reports, complaints, even officers who dared to stand against him. James had ignored it for too long, convincing himself that things would get better. But when he saw Stevens beating a handcuffed suspect in the interrogation room, he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. James gathered every piece of evidence he could. He saved security footage, collected witness statements, and even recorded conversations. He knew the risks, but he told himself that the truth was more important. When the moment came, he walked into the chief's office and placed the evidence on the desk. The chief listened in silence, flipping through the reports with a blank expression. When James finished speaking, there was a long pause. "You've made a serious accusation," the chief finally said. "Are you sure about this?" James felt a cold chill down his spine. He had expected concern, maybe even anger, but not this. There was no shock in the chief's voice, no disbelief, just careful, measured words. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't sure," James replied. The chief sighed and leaned back in his chair. He studied James for a long moment, then picked up the phone. James sat there, his heart pounding as the chief made a call. He didn't know who was on the other end, but he knew this wasn't going the way he had hoped. "Wait outside," the chief said after hanging up. James stepped out of the office, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to believe he had done the right thing, that soon the department would launch an investigation, that justice would be served. But deep down, something felt wrong. The air was thick with silence. Officers who usually greeted him with nods or smiles looked away as he passed. An hour later, he was called back in. This time, Captain Stevens was sitting in the room, his expression calm, almost amused. The chief cleared his throat and pushed the reports back toward James. "We've reviewed your claims," the chief said. "There's no solid evidence to prove any wrongdoing." James blinked. "What are you talking about? I gave you everything. The footage, the reports." Stevens leaned forward, a smirk on his face. "And yet, nothing holds up. Maybe you misunderstood what you saw. Maybe you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment." James clenched his jaw. "I saw you beat that man. He was handcuffed. He was bleeding." Stevens shrugged. "And yet there's no record of that happening." James felt his stomach drop. The reports, the security footage, he had seen them with his own eyes. Had they already erased it? How could they move so fast? The chief sighed again, as if he were speaking to a child. "Officer Carter, these are serious accusations, false accusations. This could damage the department's reputation. You wouldn't want that, would you?" James couldn't believe what he was hearing. "False accusations? You think I'm lying?" Stevens gave him a cold smile. "We think you're confused, and we're giving you a chance to let this go." James stared at them both, anger and fear twisting inside him. He had expected resistance, but he had hoped that at least someone would stand for the truth. Instead, he was sitting in a room where the guilty protected each other while the honest were silenced. "I'm not letting this go," James said, his voice steady. "I'm taking this higher." The room fell into silence. Then, for the first time, Stevens' smile faded. His eyes darkened, his fingers tapping slowly against the table. "You do what you think is right," Stevens said. "But be careful. Sometimes, the truth comes at a price." James felt his breath hitch. It wasn't a threat, not directly. But the message was clear. He wasn't just up against one man. He was up against an entire system, a brotherhood that would do anything to protect its own. As he walked out of the office, he could feel the eyes on him. Officers whispered behind his back, some shaking their heads. A few gave him looks of pity, but none spoke. He had become an outsider in his own department. When he stepped outside, he took a deep breath, trying to push away the fear that clung to him. He had done the right thing. He had spoken the truth. But as he reached his car, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. All 4 of his tires were slashed. James stood there for a long moment, staring at the damage. A message, a warning. As he looked around, he saw no one, but he knew they were watching. This was just the beginning. James didn't go home that night. He knew if he did, he wouldn't sleep. Instead, he sat in his car, parked outside an old diner, staring at his phone. He had a list of contacts, lawyers, reporters, people who might help, but his fingers wouldn't move. He wasn't scared of the truth. He was scared of what would happen next. His phone buzzed. A message from his wife. "Lisa, you okay? When are you coming home?" James exhaled slowly. Lisa had always been his rock, supporting him through everything. But this was different. This wasn't just another tough day on the job. This was war, and he wasn't sure if he could protect her from it. He typed a quick reply. "On my way soon. Love you." Then tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The air inside the car felt heavy. His whole life, he had believed in doing the right thing, in standing up for justice. But tonight, for the first time, he felt truly alone. The next morning, he walked into the department like nothing had changed, but everything had. Conversations stopped when he passed. Officers he had known for years avoided eye contact. Even his partner, Mike Turner, a man who once called him brother, barely acknowledged him. James approached him anyway. "Mike." Turner hesitated, then gave him a small nod. "Carter." James lowered his voice. "You believe me, right?" Turner glanced around, shifting uncomfortably. "It's complicated." James clenched his fists. "No, it's not. You know what Stevens does. You've seen it." Turner sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, man, I got a family to think about. We all do." James felt a sharp pang in his chest. So that was it. Fear had won. Before he could say anything else, a voice cut through the tension. "Carter, the chief wants to see you." James turned to see Officer Daniels, a man who had always sided with Stevens. The smirk on his face made James' stomach twist. As James walked toward the chief's office, he forced himself to stay calm. He had done nothing wrong. He had followed protocol. But deep down, he knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. When he stepped inside, the door closed behind him. The chief sat behind his desk, hands folded. Stevens stood beside him, arms crossed. The air was thick with unspoken words. The chief sighed. "James, we've been looking into your claims. We found some inconsistencies." James frowned. "What inconsistencies?" The chief slid a file across the desk. James opened it, his heart pounding. It was a report. His own. But the words had been twisted. Statements had been changed. Evidence was missing. The entire thing had been rewritten to make him look like a liar. James felt the room tilt slightly. This isn't what I submitted." Stevens finally spoke, his voice smooth, almost amused. "You're right. We cleaned it up, got rid of the mistakes." James' breath caught in his throat. They had erased the truth. The chief leaned forward. "James, I'm giving you a chance to walk away from this. Drop it. Let it go." James stared at them, his body tense. "And if I don't?" Stevens' smirk returned. "Then things might get difficult for you." James swallowed hard. He had expected resistance, but this was worse. They weren't just protecting Stevens. They were ready to destroy anyone who stood in their way. He stood up, gripping the arms of the chair to steady himself. "I won't stay silent." The chief shook his head, disappointment in his eyes. "Then you leave us no choice." As James stepped out of the office, he felt a shift in the air. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was a target, and he had no idea what was coming next. James didn't even make it back to his desk before he felt it. The weight of their decision. The shift in the way people looked at him. He wasn't one of them anymore. He was an outsider, a threat. As he walked through the department, officers whispered. Some turned away. Others smirked, their eyes filled with something between amusement and warning. The message was clear. He had made a mistake. When he reached his locker, he noticed something immediately. The small nameplate that read J. Carter had been scratched out. Deep, ugly marks covered his name, as if someone had tried to erase him completely. His stomach tightened, but he kept his face blank. He wouldn't let them see him break. He opened the locker. Everything looked normal at first, until he saw the note. A small, crumpled piece of paper sat on top of his things. He unfolded it with careful fingers. Walk away, or we'll make you. James exhaled slowly. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. A voice sounded behind him. Rough morning. James turned. Detective Harris stood there, arms crossed, studying him. Harris was one of the few officers James had always respected. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, but he did his job well. James held up the note. They're sending me warnings now. Harris didn't even blink. You expected anything less. James shook his head. I just thought maybe someone would back me up. Harris sighed. This place doesn't work like that. You know it. James studied him carefully. Do you believe me? Harris held his gaze. Yeah, he admitted. I do. James felt a flicker of relief. Then help me. But Harris just shook his head. I can't. James felt his chest tighten. Why? Harris lowered his voice. Because they're setting you up, Carter, and I can't go down with you. James frowned. Setting me up? What do you mean? Harris glanced around, making sure no one was listening. They're building a case against you. Twisting reports, messing with evidence. They want you gone, and they'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. James' hands clenched into fists. They can't do that. I haven't done anything wrong. Harris gave him a sad smile. That doesn't matter. You went against them. That's all they need. James felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had thought the hardest part was exposing the truth. He hadn't realized that the real fight was just beginning. Before he could say another word, a voice crackled over the department's radio system. Officer James Carter, report to the captain's office immediately. James met Harris' eyes. What now? Harris hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, Be careful, Carter. They're not just coming for your job. They're coming for your life. James turned away and walked toward the captain's office, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever was waiting for him on the other side of that door, he knew it wouldn't be good. James stepped into the captain's office, his pulse steady but his mind racing. Captain Stevens sat behind his desk, leaning back with an almost bored expression. The chief was there too, arms crossed, his face unreadable. But it was the third man in the room that made James' stomach tighten. Internal Affairs. Detective Samuel Briggs stood by the window, flipping through a file. He barely glanced up as James entered. Officer Carter, Briggs said, his tone calm, professional. Have a seat. James didn't move. I'm fine standing. Briggs shrugged. Suit yourself. He closed the file and finally looked at James. We've received some troubling reports about you. James felt his jaw tighten. Troubling. Stevens leaned forward. Seems like you've been careless with evidence lately. Mishandled reports. Maybe even tampered with a case or two. James' hands clenched into fists. That's a lie. Briggs didn't react. We'll see. We're opening an investigation into your conduct. James let out a small, bitter laugh. You're investigating me. After everything I reported about Stevens. He pointed at the captain. You're ignoring his crimes and coming after me. Briggs sighed, closing the file. We follow the evidence. James shook his head. No, You follow power. Stephen smirked. Watch yourself, Carter. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. So what now? Griggs studied him for a moment. For now, you're suspended, effective immediately. James' stomach dropped. On what grounds? Briggs handed him a letter. Pending investigation. James took it, scanning the words. His badge. His gun. He had to turn them in. They were stripping him of everything. He looked up. This is a setup. Briggs didn't respond. Stevens, however, smiled. You should have just kept your mouth shut. James felt a storm building inside him. But losing his temper wouldn't help. He had to be smart. He had to fight this the right way. Without another word, he unhooked his badge, placed it on the desk, and set his gun beside it. His hands felt empty without them. As he turned to leave, Stevens spoke again. Careful out there, Carter. Without that badge, you're just another man on the street. James didn't stop walking, but deep inside, he knew Stevens was right. And that terrified him. James stepped out of the precinct, the cold air hitting him like a slap. He had walked into that building every day for years, wearing his badge with pride. Now he walked out as a man without a uniform, without a shield, without protection. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Lisa's name flashing on the screen. He hesitated. She didn't know yet. Didn't know that everything he had worked for was slipping away. He answered, forcing his voice to stay steady. Hey, James, what's going on? She asked, concern in her voice. I just got a call from someone at the department. They said you were suspended. What happened? James exhaled slowly, glancing around as if someone might be listening. They're coming after me, Lisa. They're making it look like I'm the bad guy. A pause. Then, in a softer voice, she said, Come home. James closed his eyes for a moment. Home. It sounded like the only safe place left. I'm on my way, he said. But as he started toward his car, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Oh, wait. A warning. Then he saw it. A black SUV parked across the street. Dark-tinted windows. Engine running. Watching. James' instincts kicked in immediately. He knew a threat when he saw one. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to act normal. He got into his car, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. The SUV didn't move at first. But as he turned onto the main road, he saw it in his rearview mirror. Following. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. They weren't done with him. Getting him out of the department wasn't enough. They wanted to make sure he stayed quiet. He needed to think. He needed to stay ahead. Instead of going straight home, he took a sharp turn onto a side street. The SUV followed. James took another turn, then another. Fast, but not reckless. Testing them. They stayed on him. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He reached for his phone, hitting speed dial. Lisa picked up instantly. James. Listen to me, he said, keeping his voice low. I need you to lock the doors. Close the blinds. Keep your phone close. James, you're scaring me. What's going on? I don't have time to explain. Just do it. Now. She didn't argue. Okay. James took a deep breath. He couldn't lead them home. He had to lose them. Up ahead, the road split, one way leading to the highway, the other to an industrial area. He made his choice. He turned sharply into the industrial zone, weaving through narrow roads between old warehouses. The SUV followed, but James had one advantage. He knew this part of the city better than most. He killed his headlights and made a sudden left turn into a dark alley. Then, without stopping, he pulled into an abandoned loading dock and cut the engine. Silence. His heart pounded as he watched the SUV's headlights sweep past the alley. They didn't stop. They didn't turn back. They had lost him. For now. James let out a slow breath, gripping the steering wheel. They wanted him scared. They wanted him to run, but he wasn't going to run. He was going to fight back. James sat in the dark, gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. His pulse was steady now, steady, but burning with a new kind of resolve. They wanted to silence him, to erase him, but he wasn't done yet. He picked up his phone and called the one person who might still be able to help, Detective Harris. The line rang twice before Harris answered, his voice tense. "Carter, you shouldn't be calling me. I just got followed," James said, keeping his voice low. Black SUV, tinted windows. They weren't just watching. They wanted me to know they were there. A pause. Then Harris exhaled sharply. "Damn it." James clenched his jaw. "Tell me what you know, Harris. You said they were setting me up. I need details." Harris hesitated. "Look, man, it's bad. They're saying you tampered with evidence on a drug case from last year. Some report went missing, and now, somehow, all signs point to you." James felt his stomach twist. "That's impossible. I never touched that case." "I know," Harris said, "but it doesn't matter. They've got fake witnesses, edited reports, enough to bury you." James pressed a hand to his forehead. "They don't just want me out. They want to destroy me." Another pause. Then, quietly, Harris said, "Carter, they might be trying to frame you for more than just a dirty case." James froze. "What do you mean?" Harris sighed. "I heard whispers, okay. Stevens wants you gone permanently. If they can't ruin your name, they might try something else. An accident. A violent suspect encounter. You know how this works." James' fingers curled into a fist. He had always known corruption ran deep in the department, but this was different. This was a full-scale takedown. His mind raced. He needed a plan. If Stevens was willing to go this far, then James couldn't just defend himself. He had to expose them first. "I need to go public," James said, "before they get to me first." Harris cursed under his breath. "Do you even have proof?" James hesitated. Then his eyes flickered toward the glove compartment. The USB drive. Days ago, before everything fell apart, James had started gathering evidence, copies of reports, body cam footage, anything he could find. It wasn't complete, but it was enough to start a fire. "I've got something," James said. "Not enough," Harris warned. "You need to be careful. If you go to the wrong people, they'll shut it down before it even reaches the public." James knew he was right. He needed someone outside the system, someone untouchable. A journalist. His mind flashed to Emily Vega, an investigative reporter he had met once during a community case. She was fearless, had taken on the department before and won. "I know who to call," James said. Harris sighed. "Then do it fast." And Carter, "Yeah, they won't stop. Not until you're out of the way for good." James swallowed hard. "Then I won't give them the chance." He hung up and immediately dialed another number. Emily Vega's voice came through after a few rings. "This is Vega." "Emily, it's James Carter. I need your help." A brief silence. Then, "Tell me everything." James took a deep breath. This was his last chance. If Emily didn't believe him, if she hesitated even for a second, it was over. "They're coming after me," he said. "Captain Stevens, the entire department. They've set me up. And if I don't get the truth out first, I won't survive this." Emily didn't speak right away. When she finally did, her voice was calm but sharp. "You have proof." James reached into his glove compartment, gripping the USB drive. "Enough to start a fire." "Then meet me," she said. 1 hour. No cops. No one follows you." She gave him a location. A rundown parking garage downtown. Isolated. Safe, at least for now. James ended the call and started the car, his pulse steady. He drove carefully, checking his mirrors at every turn. No sign of the black SUV, but he knew better than to relax. When he reached the garage, It was nearly empty. Just a few cars parked near the edges, the flickering overhead lights casting long shadows. Emily stood by a silver sedan, arms crossed, waiting. James parked a few spots away and stepped out, gripping the USB in his pocket. As he walked toward her, he scanned the area. No movement, no threats. Emily raised an eyebrow. "You look like a man being hunted." "I am," James said. She gestured toward her car. "Get in. Talk fast." They both slid into the vehicle. James handed her the USB drive. "This has everything I could find: body cam footage, altered reports, internal memos. It proves Stevens has been covering up abuse, framing innocent people, and now trying to take me down." Emily plugged the drive into her laptop, scanning through the files. Her expression hardened. "This is good, but it's not enough." James clenched his jaw. "What do you mean?" She turned the screen toward him. "The evidence is strong, but if you want to take down Stevens, you need a voice. Someone inside the department to confirm this." James exhaled. He knew exactly who she meant. Harris. "He won't talk," James said. "He's scared." Emily gave him a knowing look. "Then give him a reason not to be." James ran a hand through his hair. "If I push him, they'll know I'm still fighting." Emily's expression didn't waver. "They already know, James." A tense silence filled the car. She was right. The moment he exposed the truth, there was no going back. James nodded. "I'll get him to talk." Emily shut her laptop. "Good, but we need to move fast. Once this story breaks, they'll come for both of us." James didn't hesitate. "Then let's make sure they don't get the chance." He stepped out of the car, his mind made up. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. This was war.